overall survey. I think food quality is one of those. Hit that with a 4 or 5. This is awesome stuff. I do see that we are at 1 o'clock, and I do thank you guys for coming down from lunch on time. I do want us to get started. Thank, first off, ProArc and the Rochester ISA chapter for putting on this great event. This afternoon, we have the pleasure of having Alicia Gristmacher joining us, and she is manager of IT vendor risk management at the Hyatt Hotels Corporation, and she leads global third-party risk management program with over 25 years of experience in vendor risk, cyber compliance, and information security. She oversees the full vendor life cycle from onboarding through assessments and continuous monitoring to incident recovery and even offboarding. She's known for automating those processes, improving efficiency, and aligning governance with industry standards. She holds multiple things, and I tried to get to the acronyms. I can't say them. Alphabet soup. She excels in communicating. Her second language is executive. She can speak executive quite well. And along with managing vendor relation and during cyber instances and fostering that cross-functional collaboration. She's been a speaker at ISC2, Security Congress, and the RH ISAC events. We are very fortunate to have her today and really learning some new math beyond the obvious of why 1 + 1 = 3 in third-party risk. Thank you so much, Alicia.
Thank you. No, thank you so much, everybody, for coming to my session after lunch on the second day and then following the tabletop that we had. So I really appreciate it. I tried to do a really splashy title, and I promise I'm going to show you that I really am not that bad at math. But what I'm looking to do is, you know, with the years that I've been standing up programs, you learn a lot. And with what I was tasked coming to Hyatt to do, really had me stepping outside of my comfort zone and, you know, trying to think really outside the box and how can we do things differently. And, you know, we hear a lot, buzzwords are always, and I think the new, you know, what, I don't know how many years ago it was holistic. You know, we got to look at it holistically. And I think now we're in the era of checkbox compliance. So, you know, joking aside, but when it comes to third-party risk, you know, it's one of those necessary evils that has to be done, doesn't get a lot of, you know, funding, maybe necessarily not the support, and it does end up a majority of the time becoming that checkbox. I got the assessment back, all right, I can show my auditors, I reviewed it, I did a report, boom, on to the next, and then there we're done with it. So really what I wanted to highlight today was our journey, the journey that we went through and what the CISO that I reported to at the time had tasked us with doing. Which when I explain it to you, your mouth will hit the floor just like mine did. But I really kind of wanted to step through, you know, how we sort of thought through things differently. You know, there are all of those standardized questionnaires that are out there. And, you know, yes, for, you know, starting out, if you don't know what you need to do, it's a great starting point for you. But I think at some point, you know, with the increase of the third-party incidences that are out there, we do need to take a step back and say, okay, what we're doing isn't working. We really need to kind of hold the vendors that we're doing business with to a whole new standard. So just to kind of introduce, you know, as Brian said, I have 25 years experience. I did briefly a stint as a CISO. Do we have any CISOs in here? Any? If you are, God bless you. As I said, I briefly was a CISO. That was enough for me. But you know, I started over 20 years in finance. My primary background was in banking, so standing up programs. I remember I was like, hey, there's this job called an Information Security Risk Management Coordinator, one of the longest titles, and I was like, oh, I'm like, that kind of sounds interesting. I have a bachelor's degree in anthropology. So, back then, as I know, I think we heard it a couple talks, there wasn't the education that went, so a lot of us, we learned through the regulations, Graham-Leach-Bliley, DSF. And so did 20 years, then I was like, okay, banking burned me out. I'm gonna try healthcare, the next second heavily regulated industry. Stood up a program in healthcare, worked there for about 4 years, and then actually Hyatt came knocking on my door and said, hey, we're looking for somebody to stand up a program. How about you come to hospitality? Let me tell you, I'm still always waiting for the other shoe to drop with hospitality when you come from heavily regulated, completely different environment. But with that, it brings a completely different sort of new, look into how you review your vendors and all sorts of different aspects of the different levels of risk. So really what, the 1 + 1 = 3, it's kind of a saying that myself and my team, that we've coined, because you in third-party risk, you can't take everything at that black and white face value. 1 + 1 doesn't always equal 2. So when you pull back that cover, that's when the messy reality is really there. And so my ground rules are, please ask questions, stop me. I want to hear feedback, thoughts, horror stories, so anything, that you guys experience. So definitely want it to be interactive. So core principles. This is kind of, what sort of set us off. This was the beginning of our journey. And so the story I'll share is, I came to Hyatt, I started, and the CISO at the time sat me down, and he showed me a slide. And it's a slide that they had as a part of the cyber insurance presentation that they give to the brokers. And up at the top, it had about maybe 6 or 7 of the MITRE ATT&CK categories. So, initial access, persistence, lateral movement. So a few of them. And then on the left-hand side, it had the tools that Hyatt deploys to mitigate those techniques, those attack techniques. And then really it was just plotted with colors of this tool protects against this technique. And he gives me this slide and he says, I want you to think outside the box, and I want you to create a third-party risk program, global, that can do this with 10 questions. And I was like, because we know, the industry standard questions that are out there, you're 300 plus. The SIG core, that's like 300. SIG light, I think, is what, maybe 200? Like one something. So really the principle of the task he gave us was, let's look at a new way, a new approach to ask the necessary questions to be able to dive a little bit deeper to really learn and understand how are they doing things, because just because they say they have EDR in place doesn't mean that they've got it configured correctly, which can then open up a whole can of worms. So, that's, again, talking checkbox compliance, but that's kind of like you're getting the answers at face value when you do those large standardized questions. And, that's where we really looked at blending methods where, yes, of course, from an audit standpoint, you need to have those standardized reports. You need to demonstrate, yes, we got the SOC report. Oh, yep, they have an ISO. We looked at pen testing reports. But you can kind of go a little bit beyond that, where you're going to look at and involve and build partnerships with some of your internal stakeholders. So we work closely with our cybersecurity architecture teams. We work closely with our threat intelligence teams. Our cyber architecture teams, those are really, our subject matter experts from that technical lens. We do initial review, but then we meet with them every Tuesday and say, okay, here's our pending, reviews. This is what we got. What is not clicking? And then that's where we get into that, that 1 + 1 = 3, because it's a snowball. One CISO I worked for in healthcare asked me this one question that sticks with me to this day that I tell my team all the time. And he had said, you collect all of this due diligence documentation and you perform these reviews, so what? So what? what do you do with that? You know, you're spending all of this time and all of this effort. You know, you're getting these 300 questions, but then so what? What happens next? What do you do with all of that data? And so that's really where we looked to kind of change our perspective on how we reviewed our vendors. And that's when MITRE, you know, I said, you know, is using that slide that the CISO gave us as kind of our starting point. But there's so many, you know, I use, you know, it's so long ago, but the Target breach, I think, is a perfect example of why changing your approach of how you review your vendors is really what we need to do, because Target was breached through their HVAC vendor who had elevated privileges into their network that they didn't need. Would that 300 question SIG, would it told you that? You know, so that's a really good example. And, you know, each one of these these techniques has a listing of the mitigations that you could do to protect, you know, against these. And so what we look to do is, within each of these techniques, okay, let's look at what are the mitigations there. So for example, you know, for initial access, we're like, okay, you've got, you know, phishing, and there's, you know, account policies, and, you know, multi-factor authentication. So what we did was, within initial access and everything that was listed, picked kind of what we saw, like, okay, what are sort of like the 3 top, you know, areas that are heavily exploited successfully. And so that's where we look at phishing, you know, so that's like our number 1 is, you know, do you have a simulated phishing training? What, you know, what software, how often are you doing the training? Account use policies. So, you know, are you, you know, show us what your account use policies are. Are you, you know, after 90 days, you know, are you, you know, removing access timely? And then multi-factor authentication. So that's really what we did is, you know, using the categories as a starting point, and then looking and doing a deep dive into, okay, what are those mitigations that, you know, MITRE has outlined, and then how can we craft specific questions around that, so that we could look to do that little bit deeper look into our vendors, and ultimately, you know, really develop a partnership with them. So this is an interesting use case, and I know you're gonna kind of think a thermostat, like a thermostat. What can a thermostat do? We were quite surprised. So just from a scenario, again, like a black and white face value, we had a property that was being built, and they were looking at putting in thermostats. You know, guests need comfort, and the new thermostats that are out there, well, they hook into your property management system so that they can monitor occupation, so that they could adjust, you know, lighting and environmental controls, you know, all based off of, is this room, you know, occupied right now or not. So really basic, you know, we looked at, you know, documentation that they gave, and, you know, yep, okay, everything seems, you know, pretty vanilla from the beginning. But then, once we gave them our questionnaire, and we started to do that deep dive and ask them, you know, specifics, again, like I said, you know, phishing, and, you know, do you have, you know, what's your antivirus, and, you know, what's your EDR, is it deployed on all your endpoints? We found out that they were missing, out of the 12 categories we used, like 8. And so it was crazy. You know, we found they had no dedicated cyber team. They were, you know, relying on an MSSP month to month. The choice of antivirus, I believe it was just a basic out of the box. They had no secure email gateway, no privileged access management, so forth. And this is where we get into, like I said, it's that snowball, that 1 + 1 = 3. It's that snowball, because if you just looked at what the scenario was and what they're doing in face, you're like, okay, you know, yep, it looks pretty good. But then when you start to pull back that cover and start to really look at what controls they do have deployed, and are they deploying them correctly? Then that's when the whole picture starts to really sort of come alive of the type of vendor that you're doing business with, and is there the potential where there could be, you know, an incident down the road. And where we talk about that, you know, that 1 + 1 = 3 is, you know, again, you know, looking at, you know, the target breach is, with these gaps that were identified, is there the possibility that if somebody was to get into their network, could they move laterally and get into ours and then access our crown jewels? Because they have, you know, property management, they're hooked into our property management system. So what, you know, what could they then do from there? So that's where it is. It's kind of, you know, looking out a little bit further at the bigger picture to really understand the nature of the relationship. What is this vendor doing for you? What are they going to have access to? And then ultimately, if something is going to happen, what would that impact be? So, you know, really, you know, the process, it's just very basic. You know, doing your evaluation and scoring, like you know, I don't feel like you need to, you know, have this, you know, huge algorithmic, you know, mathematical. We're scoring our vendor simple, 1 to 5. Did they meet it? Did they not? You know, below expectations, meets expectations. So it can be simple, but, you know, take the controls, map them back, and then evaluate off of that. And then that gives you your baseline to kind of have that conversation then with your vendor to say, hey, you know, this is kind of what we're seeing. There's some gaps here. You know, can we have a conversation? You know, can you kind of provide us a little bit more context? You know, give us a little bit more information of why, you know, you're using, you know, out of the box EDR. Or our favorite is they're like, well, it's Linux. You know, if I had a quarter for every, they're like, oh, it's Linux, we're good. Or no, or the other thing is, oh my gosh, some of the answers we've got, we recently reviewed one, and they're like, AWS does it all. AWS, or we're a Google shop. So it's some of the responses we get, and when we see those, we kind of are starting like a hall of fame with sort of like the best responses that we get, because you're like, and you know, laughing, but that does also open your eyes a little bit more too. And it's something that we share with our business when we kind of paint the picture of, you know, what does the risk profile look of the vendor you're to do business with. We're like, hey, you know, just so you know, some of the responses that we got from them, a little questionable. So we're not sure if this could be sort of a red flag of what a potential relationship may look like with the vendor. You know, especially, hey, you start doing business with them, you call and you need support. What could that look like? You know, and then the validation piece, you know, that's where our Tuesday meetings. And I really, you know, I think third-party risk for the longest time has always been such a silo. You've got this small team. We're a team of 3 people. I'm the manager. I have 2 analysts. It's always a small team. And so, but for some reason, us as practitioners, I don't know if we just feel like, well, we can't really, you know, I don't want to bother you, but I think to really understand, you need to bring everybody in. We have anybody that we're reviewing that, you know, deals with payment card, you know, credit cards. We've got our compliance team there because they're going to help us from a PCI perspective. They're going to look at the AOCs. Like I said, we meet regularly, have a strong relationship with our cybersecurity architecture team because they're looking at that design. Because we're getting and asking for network diagrams. We're asking what's the flow of data? You know, what does that look like? Because unfortunately, we have to think that we're building a profile of the map of the data in case they were to get breached later on, so that when there is that third-party incident, we can go back to the documentation in the record and know, all right, they've got these 4 data points and they're integrated here, here, and here. So it helps you a little bit, sort of building that profile up front will kind of help you, you know, at that crunch time later on. But, you know, the validation, it's a give and take. You know, we're bringing our initial thoughts and responses, our review, and then we have, our partners who are like, okay, yeah, this makes sense, but, ooh, these two answers that they gave, if you kind of chain them together, this is what can happen. And that's where you start to build that really good overall picture. And then of course it's, we know the auditors, we know the trail. You have to document. But again, as I said, that documentation, building that true profile of your vendor is going to potentially help you later on as well. And also be part of your continuous monitoring, because that's the piece I think that we always forget is you do your initial review, okay, we're gonna maybe based off of a tier, we're gonna review them maybe once a year, but there's that in between that we forget about. So the subjective reasoning piece that we get into, this is where you bring in those other teams, and that's where I was saying, building those partnerships with everybody around you that you work with is just so important, because they bring so many different insights that we may not think of. I don't have a technical background. I like to say I know enough to be dangerous. But that's not where I came from. My background, IT controls, compliance, audit, that's where I come. So I can take that deductive, look at what's been given to me. I can make some assumptions, do some research, but to really get into the nitty-gritty of what does this mean, that's where you can tap into those partners that you have within your own organization. I like that it's the why behind the design, getting those network diagrams, understanding the flow of the data, and then having your, like your architects or partners coming in to help you, that's where they're explaining to you that why. Why are they doing it like this, or what holes or problems does that open us up to potentially? Really, the other pieces that I think is part of, reviewing our vendors and third party that maybe we don't necessarily do anymore, but are those contextual factors. Again, based off of the industry, what regulations? So of course, if you're finance, well, you've got, I think the heavily regulated industries, while it can be gray, it is a little bit easier because things are kind of written, out for you. Graham Leach Bliley has information security standards. You've got DSF. They pretty much kind of tell you what you need to do, but not necessarily like, how you do it. But when you get into, hospitality, is where it's a little bit more, because now we've got GDPR, we've got, PCI, we've got the EU, so there's also, many other different factors. So it's looking at everything outside as well that could potentially, maybe have some kind of an impact on the vendor that you're doing business with. So, looking at, for us, again, as being, global hospitality, it's the geography. That's huge. Who are we doing? Are we doing business? Is this vendor, in the Asia Pacific? Are they in, the EU? So that plays a large factor as well in, what are those regulations that could potentially impact? What do we have to be aware of based off of the region that we're doing business in? Not only from a vendor to, providing us a service, but as a customer as well. And then, of course, the standards, looking at their maturity, taking this approach really does open your eyes into how mature this vendor is that you're doing business with. Your niche vendors, and your niche smaller vendors, we have some that, again, they're not mature. They don't have a really good security posture. But then at the same time, we've seen some that have a shop of like 5 people that are doing really, really great. So I think it's that security consciousness of who you're working with. And really that comes with, that's where I really tell my team is, we're building partnerships, because at the end of the day, we all want the same thing, and that's to protect our data, protect the relationship. So if you both have an invested effort, in this and have that give and take, you're gonna get, I think, a lot much better return from your vendor because they're seeing that you're taking the time and working with them. So, how do you blend? How do you blend? How do you, you kind of bring it all together? And it's looking at, it's taking the two approaches. So yes, you need to get the documentation. Your documentation, your standardized reports and everything, I see that as a complement to your program. But ultimately, it's the questions that you're asking. And I recently told this because, again, ours is a living process. Our program is, I think, this November, I think it'll be maybe 3 years old. So we're constantly, evolving. And I recently was talking to my team about, okay, we need to take a step back and we need to look because, okay, yeah, we're asking too many questions and then we're asking follow-up questions. So I think what we need to take a step back and look at is if you're asking the right questions up front, you shouldn't have to ask a follow-up question because you should get the necessary information that you need from that. Yeah, if you need a clarification, that's fine. But that's where I was trying to kind of steer my team is to sort of think, because they were saying, oh, well, let's kind of build in some, conditional where we're going to ask, some additional follow-up. And I'm like, wait, no. That's, we shouldn't look at putting Band-Aids on what we think, may be the problem. We need to figure out, what is the true problem? What's the root cause? Why are we asking 5 follow-up questions? Did we not word and get what we need out of that initial question? So that's where, it's taking that little bit of extra time up front on how you're going to craft, those questions and what you're going to ask. Because I don't feel like you need to ask 100 questions. If you can craft, using MITRE, say, as your guide, craft a solid, 50 questions. That should give you enough of a starting point and a lens into the posture and the environment of the vendor to be able to assign a risk rating. And then if you need to, you can kind of branch off from there and have those conversations with them. And that's where you look at it all together and it's like, okay, we're gonna document it, but what's the message that we're gonna give to our business? Hey, yes, you're good, they meets expectations, feel free. Or, okay, yes, but we're gonna give you a risk memo. We use the term a risk memo. We create a risk memo if the relationship itself is a low risk, so no sensitive components, so no integrations, no PI, no PCI, nothing like that. But there was enough troubling gaps that we found that we want to bring this to your attention. Doesn't need a formal approval or sign off, but we put together this short memo that highlights that because we want to make sure that the business is making an informed decision because that's ultimately what we do. We're here to support the business. And I always tell my team, we are successful if when we communicate our findings to the business, they get it. That's success in third-party risk management. I don't care what you say, but if you can take all of that data and synthesize it together in such a way that your business partners can make that decision on what they want to do and they understand it, that's huge. Because you're starting to then sort of send out into the world like risk knowledge to the people who will then spread that to other people. And that's really what's important at the end of the day is, we can rubber stamp and send reports out and, and hey, this is the issue that we see. But if your readers truly don't understand, then that's where you have a gap in your process because they're not going to know in the future, hey, if they come across this. So it is taking that time to ensure that you're taking that information from your analysis and digesting it and giving it back in such a way that your business truly gets it. And like I said, that's I always tell my team, after we have a really good meeting with a business and they're like, oh, this was great, we really get it. Because what we do is we provide examples as it pertains to their business line. Spa vendors, what's the bottom line to the spa business if this vendor was to go down or if there's issues? So if you show them what the risks and the impact are to their bottom line, that's when they start to really get it and they start to understand. Keeping the review current, that's what we said, that's a given. We all know that. But where that gap is, I see in the middle, and that's something that I'm trying to work on, the continuous monitoring piece, because I think that's where we fall. Now, what I'm looking to do is sort of a different way to continuous monitor. Now, unfortunately, with our climate, third-party breaches are every single day. I am so busy with third-party incidences, it's ridiculous. But there's a treasure trove of information out there for you. If you conduct, an analysis on what were all of the successful attack vectors for those third-party incidences, you can take that and use that to mature your program. Because there's evidence that this happened, this worked, this is how they got in there. So if you can take that and translate in such a way into, maybe that's part of your continuous monitoring where you're gonna follow up. Maybe that's, front loading where you're gonna actually build that into your questionnaire, into your program. There's so much really good data out there of how people got owned, how third parties got owned. And if we take that data, really kind of look at it, map it back to MITRE, and then develop your questionnaires off of that, we can almost start to evolve our area of being proactive instead of reactive. Because that's what third-party risk is, really, is we're more of a reactive. So it's like, how can we kind of elevate our field to the next level to that proactive status? That's something I'm always trying to figure out. How can I figure out with this vendor that we're doing business with, if there's the potential that there's could be a breach down the line? So it's kind of, like I said, it's really sort of looking at everything completely different. Now, we communicate to the vendor, we call them our observations and findings. But what we tell them is we can in no way act in a consultative nature to you. We cannot, legally, we can't tell you what to do. But you need to know that these gaps exist that we found from our assessment. And it's up to you how you're going to remediate that based off of what's important to you. What are your company's priorities? So that's a conversation that we do have to have a lot of times with our businesses, with our business stakeholders and with the vendors, because they'll always come to us and say, well, what do you want us to do? I'm like, well, we can't tell you that. As we say, they're suggested recommendations. But we document that because so we have that saying, here's what we found. How are you going to address that? And a lot of times we'll have conversations and we'll get on the phone and we'll talk with our vendors and just kind of, talk through and say, hey, when we were asking these questions, we kind of found these gaps. We'll talk through first, hey, is our understanding correct? Is what you told us? And then if it is, it's kind of, talking through, well, hey, you may want to look at this and, and maybe do that. But we've really had a lot of positive feedback from our vendors and have really started to develop some strong partnerships with them, because we've had a couple say, oh my gosh, we've never been asked these questions before. They're like, this is like really, because you're starting to, like I said, you're starting to pull back that curtain. And you're not taking face value anymore what they're telling you. You're starting to do something with that data. So, kind of gave you, a lot of stuff of like what our journey was, but I was trying to figure out, well, how can I kind of like take sort of what our journey was and put it in kind of like a quick, sort of like bullet list of, hey, here's some things that maybe you could try to do for yourself and give it a try. See, hey, is this something that could potentially work for us? So kind of put together what I was thinking like as a quick start of, of some things that you're able to do. And so, you've got the 12, we don't look at the first two techniques, which is research and reconnaissance, I think. So we started initial access down to impact. So take one or two of the techniques, dive in a little bit to what are some of the mitigations that are there, and then kind of craft a few questions of what you think. And you can even take this, try it out on maybe some past reviews that you've done to kind of, to get an idea. Develop those questions. Of course, get your, your evidence, so your documentation and everything. Look at maybe some past incidences, like I said, the different attack vectors and things like that that are out there. Start, start talking to your architecture teams, hey, your enterprise architecture or your cyber architecture, or even, maybe some engineers, and start to craft, what does this look like? What does my profile look like of my vendor? Hey, even, reach out and say, hey, we're trying something new. Would you mind maybe completing like a few questions? But kind of just looking to, play around with it. Like I said, you've got some past, even using like a past vendor where you've already done an assessment, you've already got it maybe risk rated, taking that and then maybe just doing the work yourself, sort of mapping it back, and then see what are the results by sort of maybe changing the way I'm looking at them or changing the questions that I'm asking. And then looking at it, from a deeper, again, it's evidence. A lot of times when we're reviewing our vendors, we're just, okay, yep, you've got that document, oh, you've got that policy, but you don't really kind of maybe look past that. So I think it's starting to maybe change the way we think about not taking them at their word so much, possibly maybe doing our own, a little bit deeper analysis. But like I was telling you, with like the target, tracing the attack path. Because you've got the HVAC vendor who had elevated access, who then was able to get into Target's environment and compromise their whole payment card system. So it's like taking maybe one of those existing vendors that you've already reviewed and maybe doing an attack path to see, holy cow, what could actually happen. Again, I can't speak enough about those relationships, building those internal relationships that you have with other stakeholders, the businesses that you're reviewing the vendors for, but then your own internal IT cyber partners, because those are those subject matter experts that they can kind of maybe weigh in and look at things from a different perspective that maybe you didn't think of. So just to kind of summarize, what we kind of talked about, but, the benefits I see with kind of changing and adjusting the way that we're reviewing our vendors is the potential to not have those surprises anymore, not have those blind spots. What are we missing? Maybe being able to dive a little bit deeper to not only understand better, find potential gaps that maybe we wouldn't have through the larger, pretty basic questionnaires, but then ultimately building that relationship with your vendors. And then, again, the math. It's what's that path? What's that attack path? How do the controls that they're saying that they have, how do they interact? And if they were to break down because of the gap, what does that look like? How could they then trace their way back into our crown jewels, into our environment? And then really, like I said, next steps, play around. Take one of the existing vendors that you've already done a review on, craft, a handful of questions, and compare and sort of see ultimately what does that look like? Are you surprised? Are you like, oh my gosh, are you, okay, we're doing pretty good with the questions that we're asking, so, it's pretty much in line. But again, it's, trying to really look at third-party risk in a different way because, again, the breaches aren't going away. it's primarily a reactive. You're looking at, post-dated documents, policies. You're taking a self-assessment, in essence, from these questionnaires. It's the vendor telling you what they're doing. And then you're kind of like reviewing it. And then you just come back to that question, well, so what? What are we going to do with this? So I think if we start to change our approach and look at our vendors, because, they want to do business with us. They're looking to get your business. So I think it's okay to put them through the ringer a little bit, because ultimately, at the end of the day, you want to get a comfort level over their control environment, that they're doing everything that they can to protect our data and to protect that flow. So I'll kind of open it up and thank you, everybody. But yeah, I'll open it up for any questions, comments.
Yeah, great job, thank you very much. The so what, right? So you get done with the risk assessment, let's say they don't have something critical like privileged access management, right? So maybe there's no PAM.
Yeah.
And you've thrown out a recommendation to that vendor, hey, this is something important, you should probably do this.
Mm-hmm.
The business says, well, that's great, we need to use that vendor. There's no other vendor, got to
Yeah.
do it. And so they're the ones that are approving it.
Mm-hmm.
But what are your thoughts then on adding that to your cyber or enterprise risk register as something that the business has to then accept that risk and manage?
That's exactly what we're working on right now, is the risk register. Because what we found, so we have a risk acceptance process. And what we're finding now is to get around our process, people are going behind our backs and just submitting a RAF. And so what we're seeing is that maybe for 1% of our population, it still has the teeth, but overall it doesn't anymore. And so that's actually, I'm working with our risk management team on just that, on the risk register. How can we take the risks that we're identifying and adding that to the risk register? Because it's got to be someplace. And that's the thing, is accountability. We have to hold our businesses and our stakeholders, we have to hold them accountable. It's like you potentially are bringing unnecessary risk into our organization because, oh, I found a shiny new toy that I want. So it is, and that's the direction that I'm looking at, is it has to be someplace where we're documenting that risk, somebody owns it, and then we're reporting on it. The other facet that we're looking at is, hey, why don't we start doing like a quarterly report to those, RVPs or whatever of the business, to show them the list of, hey, here's all your people, these are the vendors that they're doing business with, and here's all the bad vendors that they brought in. So even adding to like not just the risk register, but adding a visibility of a report card or a scorecard for the business unit itself to say, hey, I think you need to see this. Yep, here's how many vendors have, from your business unit that has gone through our review process, and here's the percentage that are below expectations. So I think it's all of that. I think it's the visibility piece, and I think that's sometimes where we do lack with third-party risk, is we don't have that sometimes. How do we communicate that, and how do we let everybody know what's the bigger picture? Yeah.
Back here, and then I'm coming up front. First of all, Alicia, thank you. That was a great presentation. I think it's a bit of a novel approach, right? I think it's kind of a new ideas for me, but a company like Hyatt, right, you've got some clout, right? You can get some vendors to do some stuff because they really want your business.
Yeah.
But smaller companies struggle with getting good questions back, and when they do get questions back, if you fill out the SIG or the CIAQ, it's yes or no.
Yep.
You don't get a lot of information. They struggle with resources to be able to support a program that's that heavy. So any recommendations for getting some traction with getting vendors to actually respond in a meaningful way?
Hey, we may be high at a global company, but I've got a queue of questionnaires that I can't get vendors to respond back to. So, and that is, I think the systemic issue is, getting them to respond back to us. What we're trying is, again, accountability. Accountability with those business partners who want to do business with them and saying, look, we are in a blocked status. You cannot move forward with your project, your initiative, until you talk to this vendor that you want to do business with to return our questionnaire. So we're kind of in the same way, we're a small team, we're 3 people. I've got 2 full-time people that just do reviews, and it's global. And we're having that issue too where, you've got some population where, yep, we get it within, because we give them a week, and then we have automated past due notifications that'll go out to them every day. So they're getting an email every day saying, hey, you're past due, and they still don't, return it. And it's an administrative burden for either small organizations or small teams where we don't have the bandwidth to just constantly harp. And so that's why we're thinking of changing our approach, going back to, if you've got, we have a commercial services project management office where intake, projects and initiatives start through there. So we're starting to actually maybe rethink and relook and say, okay, if we don't get this, we're going back to the start. And we're telling the business and the CSPMO, we are blocked, you need to deal with it because we are not project managers and we don't have the time to do it. So it's kind of like with the resources that you do have within your organization, who can you leverage? And that's why I firmly believe, holding those businesses accountable that want to do business with them, because they may have a better relationship than we do. We're just kind of, hey, we're this team, throwing you a questionnaire. So I think it's looking more of and communicating, because when they hear blocked, I can't do what I want, then you might be able to get the traction and the help that you need.
Just before you end there, one strategy I've found, at least with small organizations, Information Security Steering Committee.
Yes, yep.
If you can get them to approve any high-risk vendor acceptance, you get a team of them to do it.
Yep.
It prevents the one person from taking on risk. The rest of the organization might be a little.
Yeah. We're also, I just actually met with the CIO earlier this week, because we're actually presenting a whole new thought, and it's coming up with a list of minimal viable requirements that I met with a whole bunch of stakeholders, IAM, all of our, data privacy and governance, everybody, and said, okay, what are the specific non-negotiable items that you feel before a vendor even comes in through the intake, they need to have in place? And so we got a list and we presented, and the CIO was like, yeah, this is a great way. And so the other sort of aspect we're looking is, well, then how do you build it and front load it into the beginning to take that potential onus off of the business, where then it just kind of populates and says yes, no, or whatever, or here's your score. But that's kind of an approach that we're going to look at, is say, we've got these, we call MVRs, we're publishing them in the beginning. You need to, before you do business with anybody, you need to make sure that you have this. If you've got these non-negotiables, there's no sensitive components, so no PII, PCI integrations, then you're fast path. We're just going to do a light assessment. But if anywhere in between we see, a trigger where, oh, we found out that, there is going to be, some kind of an integration or access, then it would be rerouted through. So that's kind of something else that we're giving a try.
How long does an assessment take from start to finish on average?
So if we get it back in a week, my team, and I have to say, we're a small team, we are using AI, we have a GPT enterprise license. We don't rely on it, but that has helped for smaller teams us speed up. So my team within a day can probably perform maybe 2 initial reviews. And then, so in a day, they can pick up and maybe do 2, 3. We plan out our weeks every Monday, and I'm like, okay, guys, 5 reviews. Okay, what are the top 5 reviews that you're gonna work on in the week? But normally, if it's okay and not a whole lot of issues or problems, they could probably do 2 to 3 in a day. And then we have those Tuesday meetings every week with our other partners, so our architects, and we'll put together a summary that will then hit those key areas that they need. So the architecture design and those controls, and then we'll kind of go through a line on the scoring, and then boom, we're done. So, it probably a week, like we quote our SLA as like 2 to 4 weeks, so like 25 days. In the beginning of the process, we were 168 days. With all of the improvements we've made, as of probably end of September, we got it down to like 48. So, it's leveraging when you're a small shop, not a lot of resources. It's like, what can I leverage to help me to do that? So, that's kind of like where we're sitting, and then we're looking to make some other enhancements as well to try to see if we can kind of, maybe get through things a little bit quicker.
So we have time for really quickly, I want to catch 2 more. I'm going to catch up here, and then Chris, you're going to be finished as we wrap up. We're right at time.
Oh, are we?
now.
Okay.
We're going to go just a couple of minutes here.
Awesome.
Hi, I was just curious, what about those businesses that don't go through third party and you find out that there is intellectual property and there is
There's all this
PCI and there is all of that? So what do you do in that situation?
And happens a lot. And at that point, that's where we tell them, it's like, look, you need the risk acceptance process. So, and the same goes to where I was saying, where they'll do that to go behind our back. We'll cancel that and tell them, no, you can't do that, you need to go through. But in those instances, we tell them, we're like, look, we just found out about this. You went live already. There's all of this. So it's like, I'm sorry, but you need to have we need to put a risk acceptance form in place that will go to the VP level or above to sign that, accepting the risk that you went forward and went live before we could have ever done a review. And I think what may also help with that too is like where I was saying, like maybe like the quarterly reporting too, where you're able, I think adding visibility around that and how often it happens could potentially help, reduce. And then maybe adding that as a possible category too, like your risk register or something, but adding that visibility. But that's really kind of all we can do is, all right, we need to do a risk acceptance form because you went live, and and then we'll do the review, and then fingers crossed, you hope that they come back okay.
Real quick, if we
Yeah.
can get Chris, and then we'll get you guys going.
Yeah, so just, what are your thoughts on using third-party services to, okay,
No. Security scorecard, Blue Voyant, I've sat through, I've talked to them about their algorithms and everything, and I see it as a complement to a program. I think it's really well and good, but I don't think it's something based off of the data and like how they're reporting that it's something you should solely rely on. Now, that's just my opinion. That's my opinion and experience, but again, too, like your due diligence, like the due diligence documents and things like that, it's, those third-party ratings agencies are collecting public information. They're going out and public IP, and all that, and that's how they're getting, some of their data. So, my thought is that yes, I think it's great, I think use it as a complement to your program, but not like what you rely on totally. And then follow it up though with, with your homegrown questions to go with it.
All right, we are over. Thank you
Apologies.
so much.
Thank you so much, everybody.
We have a certificate and a gift card for Alicia.
Thank you very much.
Please go out and visit rochestersecurity.org. Click on the survey button. That helps us continue to get great speakers. Thank you guys so much.
Thank you so much. Thank you very much.
Thank
Ryan.
you.
Thank you.
I'm going to grab that, and if you
And I'll
just want
grab
to take
the
off
thing.
your body
Yeah.
pack.